Deploying and managing IP address management. After a little pause, we're finally back to a brand new feature of Windows Server 2012, and accordingly, or in accordance with what I said earlier more specifically, we really need to be on top of brand new features to pass these certification exams. We're going to start with understanding what's behind IP address management, why this makes good sense from a business perspective, what problems IPAM attempts to solve, etc. Then we're going to look at the implementation steps, the planning, the deployment, migrating your existing IP infrastructure into IPAM, what gotchas or limitations are inherent in the platform. Short story, there are a few. The specific steps, and again, as long as you're aware of those gotchas, the implementation is a lot easier. I'm going to guide you through that thorny thicket such that by the end of this nugget, you'll understand how to actually roll out IPAM in your infrastructure. It's not as complicated as you might think initially. Then, of course, I'll show you some of the day-to-day administration tasks that we can do within IPAM. Let's get started. What is IP address management? Before I define IPAM for you, friends, let me just ask you a couple questions. They may be painful questions, I have to tell you in advance. The first question is, how do you document, if you do at all, your IP infrastructure? If you were fortunate enough to work at a place where you helped design the infrastructure, then it's probably closer to what you would consider in spec, in line with your own personal vision, as well as any organizational policies, any compliance requirements that your industry is required to adhere to, etc. However, if you're more commonly going into a situation where IPv4 is already been deployed, you may have questions. Where do I get a global picture, a bird's eye perspective of our IP addresses? Especially this is relevant for larger organizations that have multiple subnets and multiple physical locations. How do you know what's what and where's where? Some administrators keep an Excel spreadsheet or a text file that contains IP addresses. That's a big problem, obviously, because we have data input errors, human errors, and also the fact that flat files are not at all dynamic. It's going to be near impossible to keep track of address leases, static assignments in the busy day-to-day operations, especially, as I said, if your IT shop is distributed among many groups in many different locations. I'll give you an even scarier question right now. Who leased a particular IP address 6 weeks ago? Or let's even say 6 months ago. You might have an issue pop up in your organization with a disgruntled former employee, and you're finding yourself as an IT manager brought into this legal imbroglio, and the defense attorneys, the prosecutors need to see records that demonstrate this particular individual's access on your network given a particular time frame. Now, if that answer or the idea of answering that question under oath scares you, then you might be a really good candidate for IP address management in Windows Server 2012. What IPAM is, friends, it's a free in-box alternative to more expensive IP address management solutions that are out there. Microsoft has its own first-party System Center suite. There are other organizations, SolarWinds, etc., that have their own IP address management stacks, but that's going to cost you extra money. Microsoft likes to give us sometimes these really awesome new features built right into the Windows Server license that you don't have to pay anything extra for. And what IPAM gives us is excellent administration over our IP infrastructure that's broken down into 4 focus areas. There's planning. This kind of stuff deals with questions like, how do we design and plan our IP address ranges? How do we plan, design, and implement our DHCP scopes? How can we build our scopes and build our IP addresses, build our subnets to support maximum growth, but at the same time be intuitive to understand, intuitive to track? Managing. Let's say you get a fleet of laser printers into your office and you need to deploy those throughout your enterprise. How can you quickly and easily create DHCP reservations or address exclusions for these devices? How do you know by picking a particular IP address out of one of your scopes that it's not already in use? IPAM allows us to handle both of these tasks in a very rich way, as we'll see. The second 2, tracking and auditing, deal with things like potential legal issues, governmental, regulatory, industry compliance schemes that some shops are subject to where you need to document the use of your IP address space. and be able to pull those records up to perhaps a year or more in the past. IPAM gives us really big bang for the buck, friends. It really does. And what it does is allows us to discover and pull data from the following Windows Server services. Of course, we have Domain Name System, DNS. Of course, we have Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, or DHCP. After all, those two server services form the bulk of our IP infrastructure, don't they? However, we also have domain controllers that need to be tracked. In many cases, we have DNS running directly on the domain controllers, after all. And the fourth server type that gets taken into or can get brought into the IPAM fold is the network policy server, your remote access server. You might think at first blush that this appears that it shouldn't be part of an IPAM scheme, but we'll remember that we can devote blocks of IP addresses for use by our remote access server. Hence, we want to be able to track those trends and so forth as well. Essentially, what we have with IPAM, friends, is a database-driven front end to your IP infrastructure. Here's what it looks like schematically. I'm just going to make use of this little area here on the whiteboard. You have all your infrastructure servers. Now, the idea here is your DNS, your DHCP, your DCs, your NPC servers, your NPS servers, may be spread among multiple sites. What you can do with IPAM is gather data from all of those into a central front end, the IPAM Management Console. In turn, IPAM uses the Windows internal database to actually store and structure the data. So if you have experience with database administration, I think you see where we're going here. Because we're using SQL Server database, and that SQL Server uses Transact SQL as its data access language, and we also have SQL Server reporting services, analysis services, all that good stuff, the capabilities there, we can take our data from our infrastructure servers and do very rich querying and reporting therein. That's the idea. Now, every rose has its thorn, right? There are some gotchas or limitations to IPAM that you really need to be aware of. First of all, and most significantly, there's no central reporting with IPAM. That is to say, every IPAM server is an island unto itself and cannot communicate with other boxes. You know, for instance, how with Windows Server Update Service, you can have multiple peer replicas and you can have parent-child replication situations. Unfortunately, we don't have that ability with IPAM. Each IPAM server writes to its own Windows internal database. Now, the WID, as it's called, is a stripped-down, redistributable version of SQL Server. It has hardware limitations, it has file size and memory limitations. But as you'll see in another slide, Microsoft has scaled the database and scaled the service such that in most cases, you probably can get away with having a single IPAM server, because the actual IPAM server itself isn't doing too much other than data gathering, data writing, and data retrieval. And at that, most of those tasks run as scheduled tasks, task scheduler tasks, and potentially they can run during periods of lower utilization in your network. What Microsoft recommends, because we don't have this ability to link multiple IPAM servers, is that if you're in a geographically distributed situation with your organization, you can just simply run multiple instances of the IPAM server feature and then basically partition off your infrastructure servers accordingly, such that maybe we have North, Central, and South American locations. Bring up an IPAM server in each one of those locations and just simply customize our scope, our discovery scope, to hit infrastructure servers only within that geographic location. You follow what I'm saying? Another gotcha with IPAM is that your advanced data gathering stuff, utilization trends, which is useful to see at a glance how many IPs you might have left in a given DHCP scope. And IP address reclamation, gathering, scavenging, all that kind of stuff, is limited to IPv4. Now, this strikes me as a potentially devastating limitation. I hope that Microsoft adds in full support for IPv6. After all, as I've repeated like a parrot several times over this training, we need to be doing everything we can to migrate our networks to IPv6 now, and it's weak, in my opinion, that IPAM isn't there with that. Yet, at least. Finally, and this is probably no surprise to us, the IPAM service only discovers and tracks Microsoft network elements. So we can't have a bind DNS server from a Linux or OS X box or a non-Microsoft DHCP server in the mix. If you do have them, even if you can support that, they're not going to be tracked by IPAM and therefore are going to skew your statistics. So IPAM itself is heavily skewed toward purely Microsoft shops. Let's take a look at some of the IPAM numbers, the numbers you find at TechNet or in any of the marketing material that Microsoft publishes to promote this technology. According to Microsoft, a single IP address management server can track up to 150 DHCP servers and up to 500 DNS servers. Those are pretty impressive numbers. You'd have to be a pretty large enterprise to get up close to that limit. And I think, again, that's by design. On the forensics compliance side of the fence, IPAM can store, or does store, 3 years worth of forensic metadata for up to 100,000 users. Again, that's a pretty significant user pool that's certainly going to cover all small and medium-sized use cases. This forensic data is stuff like IP address lease metadata, MAC addresses, and user logons and logoffs. Therefore, that question I gave you in the introductory slide of this nugget, who leased this particular IP address 6 months ago, is a very easy query to perform with an IPAM. Now then, let's look at the deployment procedure from a bird's eye perspective, and then I'll show you how it works in the demo. I probably could have added this first bullet point to the gotchas list, and I myself, the very first time I tested IPAM, made the mistake of trying to install the feature on a domain controller. IPAM will not, and I repeat, will not work on a domain controller. However, the machine that you do select for the IPAM feature does have to be a domain member, and that should be pretty obvious and pretty clear. On a related point, similar to DNS, similar to DHCP, IPAM will populate your Active Directory database with a number of sub-administrative local, domain local user groups. You have IPAM administrators, IP audit administrators, ASM administrators, MSM, IPAM users. This supports the notion of delegated administration. Potentially in large shops, IPAM management, or just the audit aspect of it, may occupy more time than you're willing to devote, so you can recruit, quote-unquote recruit, someone else in your organization to take over just looking at the audit and IP address tracking information without making that user a domain user. So that's always cool. Okay. We install the IPAM server feature with PowerShell or Server Manager, no surprise there. And then, as you'll see in the demo, the setup from there is pretty cool because the GUI will actually step us through the steps of provisioning the server scope. In other words, what servers will be affected, basically from a client perspective, which infrastructure servers will be clients of a particular IPAM server. That's configured through group policy objects. Now, you can do it manually, but that's going to involve you horsing around with WinRM rules, Windows firewall exceptions. I strongly recommend you let the group policies that get pre-built for you take care of that kind of business, the WS discovery, blah, blah, blah. Once you've done that, once your server scope is ingested through group policy, you can instruct the IPAM server to kick off an automated discovery of servers that fall within that scope, and then you register them with IPAM, and then from there it's just a question of day-to-day administration. Of course, a popular question is going to be, do I still use or can I still use the DNS management console and the DHCP management console after moving to IPAM? And the answer there is yes. As a matter of fact, with DNS, you have to use either PowerShell or the DNS management console because there's not in-box management capability within the IPAM GUI. By contrast, you can manage all aspects of your DHCP server through IPAM, and that includes managing scopes, creating scopes, etc. You'll also see in the demo some new nomenclature that we'll cover in detail when we see it. IP address blocks and ranges. Now, if you already have scopes, you already have IP addresses that are there, they will get embraced and brought in during discovery. Blocks refer to what you have in terms of full-on IPv4, IPv6 address pools. Ranges are subsets of those pools that are typically going to be deployed as DHCP scopes, aren't they? And you can report on utilization, trends, etc. The trending takes a while to generate enough data to give you a graph to look at. You're not going to see in the demo that because I haven't had this running for long enough. But I'll at least show you where the charts will exist in the GUI. And with that, let's get into the demo and I'll show you how the click-through procedure works. All right, let's get this party started. Welcome to this demonstration of IP address management in Windows Server 2012. Let me start off by showing you our topology. We are on a domain member server named FSNugget, as you can see with my BG info down here, and I've also added in my additional servers into my server manager instance. Specifically, we have a domain controller called DC01, we have a DHCP server running on InfNugget, and we have two DNS servers, both DC1 and InfNugget, run DNS. We also have a Windows 8 workstation called CleanNugget001. Now the first step to getting IPAM up and running is installing the feature, which I'm going to do through the graphical wizard. We'll do a role-based installation, make sure we're selecting the appropriate box in the list. Actually, we're going to do this on FSNugget, not InfNugget. That's a best practice from Microsoft, by the way. Not only can we not do IPAM server on a domain controller, Microsoft recommends going so far as to install it on a non-infrastructure server. FSNugget is my file server, and it's not doing much by way of TCP/IP. Let's go past the server roles page to the features, and we have, let me scroll down a bit, the IP address management server. Of course, that instantly brings up related tools and dependencies. We have a bunch of Framework 4.5 features, group policies, what we'll need, clearly. We need the GPMC console, remote administration tools, blah, blah, blah. I do want you to see the Windows internal database as we previously discussed. Let's add those features in, click Next, and install. All right, well that completed successfully, so let's refresh our view here, and we'll see a new service node added to Server Manager called, appropriately enough, IPAM. It creates a secondary interface that at first blush is kind of clunky. It minimizes all your other icons. You can bring those back, of course, easily enough just by clicking. But as I told you, the configuration, the server tasks are nicely laid out here. You see it's literally step by step by step, and each of these steps is individually hyperlinked. We've already done step 1. We've connected to FSNugget, so our next step is to provision the server. Let's click that link and it brings up another wizard dialog box. All this is to say that we're going to manage a scope of our servers running these services, and we can do that scope of service either manually or through GPO. Well, let's click, and the default is GPO. Definitely recommended. Now, IPAM is going to build the GPOs with the WinRM and WS protocol and Windows firewall rules in it. We just have to provide a unique prefix. I'm going to, imaginatively enough, use IPAM. There's also a note here that many people miss the first time through and it winds up biting them. This is going to set the stage for the management, but we also have to create the GPOs in each domain by using the IPAM PowerShell commandlet invoke IPAM GPO provisioning. Let's click Next. It reminds us that we need to run invoke IPAM GPO provisioning, and it tells us that the wizard is going to install the database, create our security groups, our sub-administrative groups, and configure access to IPAM scheduled tasks and folders. Let's confirm. Now, you'll note in Group Policy Management that we don't have those IPAM GPOs actually created yet. I can refresh the view just to prove that to you right now. Let's come back to the IPAM console. Again, make sure we're refreshing to see the latest data. It tells us that we've completed step 2. We can now move on to configuring automated IPAM discovery of services. We first select the domain or domains to discover. I have just the one, so I'll bring that down. And by default, it's going to scour for all of those services. Now you can deselect any services that you're not looking for. It again reminds us that we need to run this commandlet to actually create those GPOs using the provisioning prefix and other settings. And then finally it tells us that this discovery schedule can be changed by modifying a particular task scheduler task called Server Discovery. It's under the path Microsoft Windows IPAM. For now, let's click OK, and let me refresh the server view. We'll go to step 4 now and run the discovery job manually. We see a little dialog here that says there are one or more IPAM tasks running in the task scheduler. Please wait for their completion. And if we click more, it brings up the task details box, which I'm sure you're familiar with if you've used Task Scheduler at all. After a few minutes, the status now shows complete. It discovered services based on a particular time and date stamp, and it's going to run it again periodically depending upon the task scheduler defaults. Let's manually refresh our view in IPAM and come down to select or add servers to manage and verify IPAM access. Now, don't be surprised when we see the warning symbol and the IPAM access status being blocked. That's actually to be expected right now. If we go down to details, we can again verify the problem, and the solution is to set manageability status. Basically, our IPAM server hasn't yet been given permission to manage other boxes or detected boxes, in this case 2, our DC01 and InfNugget, via group policy. So now we finally need to run that PowerShell command that I mentioned before. Now I'm doing this from within the PowerShell ISE to make it easier to show you, and you can do that by right-clicking the PowerShell icon on the taskbar and selecting Run ISE as administrator. It's just traditional one-off PowerShell, friends. This one is invoke IPAM GPO provisioning. The case doesn't matter with PowerShell. You can do it all lowercase, you can do it mixed case, you can do it uppercase. As long as the words are spelled correctly, which sometimes is the trick, you're good. The parameters we need are domain, mine is nuggetlab.com. We need to specify the fully qualified domain name of our IPAM server. In my case, it's fsnugget.nuggetlab.com. And our delegated GPO user is my administrator, my domain admin. So let's run this guy. We get a confirmation message box that tells us that this step is going to create and link 3 GPOs at the domain level for provisioning IPAM access on the server. So basically, it's giving permission for my IPAM server to periodically probe the detected servers in the scope. We obviously want to continue this. So I clicked yes, and we get some feedback down below that I unfortunately hid. But because the task completed, we can rest assured that things completed successfully, and of course trust but verify. If I refresh my view in Group Policy Management, we have under the domain level new GPOs, one for NPS, one for DHCP, and one for DNS. And we can come over to the settings page. This is a really nice interface. It's one of those best kept secret things. You don't have to go drilling into a GPO and fishing around looking for where settings are shown. You can do that through this settings pane really easily. And if I show all, we can see as expected, we have group restrictions, we have Windows Firewall with advanced security rules, and then we have provisioning options here with scheduled tasks, etc., and so forth. Good. I think you've got the general idea. Let's come back to Server Manager, refresh our view. It might take a little while for this unblocked status to happen. Of course, we can run a GP update force to help this along. Alternatively, we can go at the individual server level here, and again, we're in IPAM. In fact, we can step back. I'll show you. Select or add servers to verify. And for InfNugget, we can right-click, refresh server access status. That kicks off a job. We'll do the same thing, refresh server access status. This might take a while for GPOs to propagate, get ingested, etc. You can also, while we're here, right-click and edit server, and let's change the manageability status in these guys to managed. Note that there's also some additional metadata fields here for owner, description. You can override the server type if the automatic discovery failed somehow. Now let me right-click this guy, edit server, and set him to managed as well. Slowly, the status is changing. You see that DC01 has gone from an X to a check. It's showing IPAM access is unblocked, and the access status is fine now, so that's good. So it should be just a moment of time when InfNugget comes online in an unblocked status as well. After a long and indeterminable wait, I finally have all of my detected machines and services in an unblocked status. This is going to be probably the most frustrating aspect of IPAM setup for you. You'll find seemingly random cases where particular servers stubbornly get stuck in the blocked state. Sometimes it's as easy as stopping and restarting the DNS or DHCP service on the blocked boxes. You definitely want to make sure your group policies have propagated properly. Some users have reported rebooting your servers fixes it. Sometimes it's just a matter of time. I've seen a case, I've done quite a bit of research on this, that recommends that you add the IPAM server to the event log readers group in your domain. I've also seen a solution that proposed adding the IPAM server to the DHCP administrators group on your DHCP server. Hopefully, we're just looking at some rough edges. This is an initial release, and Microsoft will fix these problems and make this more streamlined as we go along. All right, at any rate, what we want to do, I did a shift-click to select both of my boxes. We can right-click and do a retrieve all server data. And all of this is going to kick off multiple scheduled tasks. You see here, if I open the notifications window, it shows you the specific name of those scheduled tasks. And if you're really interested, you can open up the Task Scheduler tool and take a look at it there as well. If we come back to our overview pane, we'll see that the 6th step is to run all of your data collection tasks. In the middle part, we see, frankly, what I think is kind of a waste of space. It just shows us a Visio-type diagram that shows us what our network looks like. Over in Configuration Summary, these are basically just documentation blurbs. And then down at the bottom, this is perhaps more useful, shows us your running status of scheduled tasks. Unfortunately, you can't see the task by right-clicking or double left-clicking it, but anyway, let me stretch out the IPAM pane. Overview, you shouldn't need to visit again unless, like I said, you want to look at your scheduled tasks. Server inventory is important if you're having connectivity problems. IP address space page is a lot of documentation. Too much, I think, in this space. Now we start to get into some of the data. IP address blocks that have been detected through discovery, and then IP address inventory information. The Tasks menu allows you to start adding in those ranges yourself, and you can even create range groups. Because I have 2 scopes on my DHCP server, 10 dot, which is an active scope, and 172.16 dot, that's not an active scope, those show up as ranges. And you notice that you get utilization statistics here. And if we adjust the pane, we can look down below for configuration details per scope. This one's actually being used, so let me check it out. Shows us that we have 4 utilized addresses with 235 assigned, that is part of the range, but not actually handed out yet. Trending data is cool. You have some flexibility here in scope. Of course, I haven't had this running very long, so it's not giving us much flexibility, but you can scope that as well as look at event IDs that are pertinent for particular IP addresses. Speaking of IP address blocks and ranges, by the way, the Tasks menu is our best friend. There's import and export capability, and they come out as CSV. Now, to answer the question, how do I import my current data that's in Excel into IPAM and have it just work? The best thing to do, in my opinion, is to export something from IPAM as CSV, look at how it's formatted, and then do the same thing coming back in. Now, I don't have a good tool to look at this data. In fact, let me right-click, open with, see if Notepad is any better. No, it's not any better, unfortunately. But by doing an export, you can see the columns in the data that's being looked for, and you can populate that as richly as possible in your spreadsheet, and then just do the opposite. That is, in the IPAM console, you can bring in a new block, or even ranges, or even individual addresses, by using the import functionality. And sure enough, it's looking for a CSV file here. Now, if you right-click an IP address block that's been detected, picked up by DHCP, we can edit the IP address range, and this gives us a form that we can customize really everything about the service. Do you automatically want to assign address values? Now, you'll notice that a lot of this is read-only because it's configured at the scope level on the server. That is, we can come down to the next section called Monitor and Manage, and in particular, we have a node for DNS and DHCP servers. For our DHCP server, also shows uptime, which is kind of cool. We have lots of server property statistics, options at various levels, different classes, class IDs, etc. An event catalog, this is useful for reporting purposes for sure. If you right-click, you'll notice you can do just about anything you want to that address range, including creating a scope, launching the DHCP management MMC. It maps to the correct server in this case, InfNugget. You can create your classes or force a data retrieval. Now, creating a scope is kind of cool. You can do a lot of neat stuff. I'm going to call this test scope, and I'm going to make the start address 192.168.1.1. It's going to be a Class C address. We can adjust the lease duration. We can set exclusions from here. We can activate. It's basically everything we see in the MMC console, just in one simple form. The way navigation works is pretty cool. You can just disclose different sections here. We can do DHCP name protection, dynamic updates. If we go to options, we can add in all of our stuff, our user class options, our standard scope options. Advanced, we can specify whether we're targeting DHCP, BootP, or both. Subnet delay, all that's from the MMC. And then finally, a summary screen. We click OK to deploy that scope. And of course, we have a node for DHCP scopes specifically that pull more data. It shows us active versus inactive, or inactive actually. All of these are sortable as you would expect. You can sort on any criteria. Now, with regard to DNS, you can monitor the status of a zone. At a glance, you can tell whether a zone is online or offline right here. If we right-click, we can reset the status of a zone. We can pull data, but we can't really do all that much. If we right-click the DNS server node, basically you can just launch the DNS MMC console, like so. And then finally, Event Catalog is simply a filtered view of our event viewer with event log entries that are auto-filtered for IPAM configuration. Now this interface would look better if you had a large monitor, a large resolution monitor, to where you could choose an event up on top and then easily see the details down below. Speaking of details down below, you'll see we have this tree view here where we can scope different types of sub-events, and we can do IP address tracking based on particular parameters. For instance, let's say we were interested in 10.00.20. I'll say, who owns that address since today and today? Guess it's not letting me do that, so I'll put in yesterday's date. Alternatively, we can search by client ID, host name, or username. Let me do a host name search for CleanNugget001 and click search. This brings back all of the matches on that criteria. So it works anyway. IP address, client ID, host name, or username. This is just simply dipping into that Windows internal database and running queries. Very, very helpful, as I said earlier, from an auditing standpoint. A couple more things I quickly want to show you. Let's come back to IP address blocks and select our 10 dot block. Let's say that we needed to configure a reservation for a network printer that we just bought. Normally, how do you do that? How do you figure out at a glance what your next available IP address is? With IPAM, all of that complexity is abstracted from us. Check this out. We can right-click, find and allocate available IP address. Isn't that awesome? And not only will it find a proposed address, but it will actually ping it to see if it's online or not, and run a DNS check to see if a resource record has already been registered for that box. So if I want to create a reservation for this guy, I'm going to need a MAC address and determine its management properties. This is going to be a reserved address. Assignment date, you can even actually have it end after a particular date and time. See if there's anything else that's required here. I'll make InfNugget our reservation server name, and the reservation is for DHCP. And check this out. You can even synchronize records to a particular DNS server. There's custom fields as well that I won't mess with. I'll call the reservation printer1 and the device name printer1. And we can apply that guy, and we've got ourselves a reservation. We can see that reservation show up as an IP address record in our IP address inventory. At a glance, we can see whether the reservation's been expired or not. And so there you have it. I think I've done more than scratch the surface of IPAM in Windows Server 2012, but there's still much more to be discovered. I'll leave that to you to do. And make sure to let me know your results or if you have any questions. Deploying and managing IPAM review. I hope that you feel more comfortable with IP address management now, friends, because like any new technology, you can expect to see pretty robust coverage on it on not only your 412 exam, but any Windows Server 2012 exam that Microsoft publishes. You should understand what problems IPAM seeks to solve, and in my opinion, for the most part, does neatly solve those problems. You should understand the limitations of IPAM, situations where you would not advise someone go for an IPAM solution. You know the click-through procedure for implementing IPAM, including the ability to import data via a CSV file or migrate infrastructure into IPAM. We know that that's automatic for any infrastructure that's already in place, and you can bulk add new IP address blocks and ranges, as I said, using CSV. You also are familiar with some of the day-to-day administration tasks and how the DNS and DHCP Microsoft Management Consoles fit into the IPAM GUI. I hope that this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.